Flintstones. They're a modern Stone Age family. From the town of Red Rock, they're a page right out of history. Let's ride with the family down the street, through the courtesy of friends to feet. When you're with the Flintstones, have a yabba dabba do time, a dabba do time. We'll have a gay old time.
In a world overflowing with movies, we need a hero. Someone to separate the bad from the good.
Sounds like a job. Verbal dioramas. Watches all the movies, from comedy to drama. From the top roll sound, and don't forget the action. She'll watch until the end, and then she'll give you her reaction. Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequels, sequels, remakes, and trivia and outtakes. Movies you know, movies you don't. Interesting stories, all the categories.
Hi everyone, I'm Em. Bezelment plot in a family movie. No, I'm joking. I'm Em, and welcome to Verbal Diorama, episode 253, The Flintstones. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't. And as always, a huge hi and welcome to Verbal Diorama. Whether you are a brand new listener, whether you are a regular returning listener, thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. I'm so grateful that you are here, and also just happy to have you here generally for the history and legacy of the Flintstones. I, yabba dabba do, hope you enjoy this episode. There will be lots more puns, I'm not sorry. But as always, huge thanks to everyone who does listen to this podcast on the regular, has continued to listen and support this podcast. It's now been going 5 years, it's been going for over 250 episodes, so I like to think I'm doing okay. But genuinely, thank you so much for your support. It means so much to me to have you here with me. And thank you for all of the lovely comments for the most recent episodes. Episode 250, Back to the Future, that kind of had the most because it was a bit of a landmark episode. Episode 251 was on Van Helsing, and the last episode, 252, was on Shakespeare in Love, which was a hell of a lot of fun to talk about, but also it meant mentioning that person quite a few times, and every single time feeling a bit sick in my mouth. So that was nice. But we are finishing this very eclectic month of April with The Flintstones, a movie I have a lot of fondness for, and not just because I remember going to see this at the cinema with my family when we went on holiday once. This episode is just an excuse for me to gush all over the production design, set design, and of course Jim Henson's Creature Shop. Regular listeners of this podcast will know I'm a huge fan of puppet work, and Jim Henson's Creature Shop is one of the best places to go for amazing puppets and amazing puppet works. But the story of the making of the story of the Flintstones' first live-action adaptation is, excuse the pun, a rocky one. Here's the trailer for The Flintstones.
You are about to embark on an extraordinary journey, a voyage to the very dawn of civilization, to a place called Bedrock.
Hey, the K vacuum forecast for tonight calls for light seismic activity and a 20% chance of meteor showers.
Where human society as we know it was born. It was home to modern Stone Age man. Home to the Flintstones.
Wilma, I'm home!
This summer, from Universal Pictures and Amblin Entertainment.
Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. They're not a Stone Age family. From the town of Bedrock, they're a page right out of history. Let's ride with the family down the street.
John Goodman, Rick Moranis, Elizabeth Perkins, Rosie O'Donnell, Kyle MacLachlan, Halle Berry, Jonathan Winters, the BC-52s, and Elizabeth Taylor.
Fred Flintstone, you've arrived.
I'm only one man.
Not from the back.
It doesn't get any better than this.
Steven Spielberg presents The Flintstones. directed by Brian Levant.
The Flintstone and Rubble families are close friends living next door to each other in the prehistoric town of Bedrock. When Fred Flintstone gives his family savings to his best friend Barney Rubble, Barney and his wife Betty can finally adopt their longed-for child Bam Bam. Determined to return Fred's kindness at the Slate and Company aptitude test, Barney switches tests with Fred for an executive promotion. Fred gets the position and his first task is to fire the lowest scoring employee, which now happens to be Barney. With Barney and Betty now struggling to make ends meet, Fred and his wife Wilma are living in the lap of luxury. However, little does Fred know that his newfound position is all part of a sinister plot for embezzlement of the company, and he's the fall guy. Let's run through the cast for this movie. We have John Goodman as Fred Flintstone, Rick Moranis as Barney Rubble, Elizabeth Perkins as Wilma Flintstone, Rosie O'Donnell as Betty Rubble, Kyle MacLachlan as Cliff Vandercave, Halle Berry as Miss Sharon Stone, Elizabeth Taylor as Pearl Slaghoople, Jonathan Winters as Grizzled Man, and Harvey Korman as the Dictabird. With cameos by Lorraine Newman as Susan Rock, Jay Leno as the host of Bedrock's Most Wanted, Fred Schneider, Kate Pearson and Keith Strickland of the B-52s appear as the BC-52s, and original series creators William Hanna and Joseph Barbera appear as a boardroom executive and a man driving a Mercedes, respectively. Sam Raimi also appears as Cliff in Bedrock's Most Wanted. Mel Blanc voices Dino using archival footage as the actor passed away 5 years before the film's release. The only surviving major cast member from the original TV show, Jean Vanderpil, the voice of Wilma, cameos behind Dino in the conga line as Mrs. Feldspar. The Flintstones was written by Tom S. Parker, Jim Genowine and Stephen E. D'Souza, and directed by Brian Levant. But that is not the first time we're going to be talking about the writing team of this movie. 30 years ago, or 3 million years ago, whichever came first, the Flintstones live-action movie premiered. 64 years ago, the Flintstones became the first ever animated primetime sitcom created by Hanna-Barbera. Hanna-Barbera's successful series The Huckleberry Hound Show and The Quick Draw McGraw Show were great but didn't appeal to a broad audience, unlike Tom and Jerry, which delighted both kids and grown-ups. Hanna-Barbera's shows were branded as kids only, as most animation unfortunately now is, but Hanna and Barbera wanted to bring animation back to a mature audience and recapture it with an animated sitcom. Original ideas were for a family of hillbillies, a family of pilgrims, an indigenous American family or an ancient Roman family, which would become the Roman holidays, but they decided upon the Stone Age as a setting because you could make anything modern into stone, and the working title became The Flagstones, with the original treatment written by Harry Winkler, famous for his work on The George Gobel Show, and he would go on to write episodes of The Addams Family, The Doris Day Show, and Julia, the first commercial TV series to star an African-American woman in the lead role. Originally, the family was Fred and Wilma and their son Fred Jr. This modern Stone Age family was widely known as being inspired by The Honeymooners, the most popular show on American TV at the time, especially the character of Fred. Even 2 of Jackie Gleason's writers were hired to work on the Flintstones eventually. Pitching the first ever animated primetime TV show to networks and sponsors wasn't easy. William Barbera pitched the show to multiple executives for 8 weeks and received no takers. The very last pitch he did was to ABC, at the time a young network willing to take risks. They bought the show within 15 minutes. The Flagstones became the Flintstones, to avoid confusion with the Flagstones, characters in the comic strip Hi and Lois, after a brief period as the Gladstones. Fred Jr. was removed and the idea became to focus on Fred and Wilma as a young married couple. The series was originally intended for an adult audience, despite its fantastical premise and animation. The first 2 seasons were sponsored by Winston Cigarettes, and Fred and Wilma would end the episodes smoking these cigarettes in an integrated commercial, something that was commonplace at the time. The intended adult audience was also mirrored in the humour, which included a laugh track and ended each episode with a resolution of a family issue, much like the comedies of the time on primetime American TV. The third season would change the show, not just going from black and white to colour, but also with the introduction of Pebbles. Originally, Hanna-Barbera wanted the Flintstones child to be a boy, but were convinced by the marketing department that girl dolls sell better than boy dolls. Winston Cigarettes pulled their sponsorship, and Welch's grape juice became the primary sponsor instead. After Pebbles' birth, the audience demographic expanded, and the series was marketed as a family series rather than the adult animated show of the earlier seasons. The Flintstones was originally broadcast on ABC from the 30th of September 1960 to the 1st of April 1966. And it was an immediate primetime hit, and it became even more popular when it was sold to syndication in 1966 and began airing on Saturday mornings, inspiring more family-based animated sitcoms, most notably The Jetsons, a similar family setup but set in the future. And this movie isn't the first attempt at a Flintstones movie either. The Man Called Flintstone, directed by Joseph Barbera and William Hanna, came out in 1966 with a plot parodying spy films. There's also been many spin-off shows, compilation shows, TV specials, TV films and potential reboots of the original animated Flintstones, but we're not here to talk about them. So let's talk about the making of the 1994 movie version of the Flintstones. 19 years after the original run of the Flintstones ended in 1985, with the show still in syndication and still appearing regularly on TV, a live-action film of the Flintstones was being considered. Producers Keith Barish and Joel Silver acquired the rights to a live-action version of the Flintstones in AD 1985, and they commissioned Stephen E. D'Souza to write the script. The first of many, many writers who would get a stab at writing the Flintstones, but only one of 3 who ever got credit. Richard Donner was hired to direct, and John Candy and Jim Belushi were eyed for the lead role of Fred Flintstone, with Rick Moranis considered for Barney Rubble. But D'Souza's script was submitted in September 1987 and rejected shortly afterwards. A new script by Daniel and Joshua Goldin was submitted in October 1989, which was also turned down. Peter Martin Wortmann and Robert Conte submitted another draft in March 1990, before Mitch Markowitz was hired to write a script. Markowitz's script was a Grapes of Wrath type thing, where Fred and Barney leave their town during a terrible depression and go across the country looking for jobs. They wind up in trailer parks trying to keep their families together, whilst also exhibiting moments of heroism and poignancy. Markowitz's version was apparently too sentimental for Richard Donner, who didn't like it, and back to the drawing board they all went. A further draft was then submitted and revised by Jeffrey Reno and Ron Osborne in 1991 and 1992. These were no good either. Donner would oversee 5 different scripts from 8, count 'em, D'Souza, Goldin, Wortmann, Conte, Markowitz, Reno and Osborne, 8 writers, and none of them would cut the mustard. And we have concrete evidence for this. So that's the first 8 writers done. Let's see if we can find some more, shall we? Richard Donner would end up leaving the project, and the rights of the Flintstones were acquired by Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment, and the first thing Spielberg did was nix all the previous scripts. Also, I feel like we need to discuss the whole Steven Spielrock thing. I do get it, but the berg in Spielberg literally means mountain or hill. Mountains are, by their own design, rocky. But I'm just being a pedant, so let's move on from that. Spielberg also enlisted lifelong Flintstones megafan Brian Levant as the director, after his hit Beethoven made $142 million worldwide. And when I say megafan, I mean a 40-year-old man who proudly displayed a 140-piece collection of Flintstones memorabilia that he'd spent years assembling, including a 1962 Barney Rubble doll with green hair, and a replica of Fred and Wilma's stone house with a slab roof that, when removed, reveals a cereal bowl. His love for the series was the reason he was hired, and he was dead set on making this a live-action cartoon. Most film adaptations of cartoons play down the cartoon origins, but not this movie. This movie would embrace its cartoonish qualities. Spielberg was working on the movie always with John Goodman, and as soon as the Flintstones project came up, Goodman was the only person he wanted to play Fred Flintstone. Had Goodman turned down the role, Spielberg didn't want anyone else, and the movie probably would have remained unmade. But they didn't have a script, and Spielberg threw out all the previous scripts. And so Michael J. Wilson was hired to write a 4-page treatment, which turned into a new script by Jim Genowine and Tom S. Parker, the other 2 credited writers. Now you'll note at this point that Stephen E. D'Souza's script was thrown out by Spielberg, but we're going to be coming back to that. The script still needed a bit of work. So Gary Ross, who would go on to direct Pleasantville, I've done an episode on that, it's episode 6, and The Hunger Games, was hired to write a new draft, but this would lead Levant to take a leaf out of TV sitcom writing and compile a writer's room with comedy talent from shows like Family Ties and Happy Days. The Flintstones was a sitcom, so why not write this feature-length movie like a feature-length sitcom? It's worth noting that movies aren't made this way, and this is the first time on this podcast that a team of writers in a room together has been used to write a movie. This team was dubbed the Flintstone 8. The Flintstone 8 were Al Adekman, Cindy Begel, Lloyd Garver, David Silverman, Steven Sustasik, Nancy Steen, Neil Thompson, and also the director Brian Levant. I think we're up to 20 writers at this point, but honestly, I'm starting to lose count, and I'm not trying to slate anyone here. The group wrote a new draft, but 4 more roundtable sessions ensued, each of which was attended by new talent, including Rob Dames, Lenny Rips, Fred Fox Jr., Davis Saville, Lon Diamond, David Richardson, Roy Taitcher, Richard Gurman, Michael J. DiGaetano, and Ruth Bennett. City Slickers and Parenthood co-writers Lowell Gans and Babaloo Mandel worked on it next with Levant, taking home a reported $100,000 for just 2 days' work. Now, I'm no mathematician, but that's 32 writers. I'm sure we're missing a few, because who knows? The general consensus for the Flintstones is 32 to 35 writers, but I could only find the names of 32. However, I'm going to list them all in the show notes to give these 32 people the credit they deserve for writing this movie, and we're going to come back to exactly how only 3 writers got credit in a bit. So eventually, a script containing elements from many different writers came together, and the movie got a green light, with Danny DeVito turning down the role of Barney Rubble, thinking he was too gruff for the part, but instead recommending Rick Moranis, who'd been considered for the role initially. Up for the role of Wilma Flintstone was Gina Davis, but she had to back out due to other commitments. Catherine O'Hara and Faith Ford were also considered, but the role would go to Elizabeth Perkins. And it's thought that the signing of Angelica Houston by Paramount to play Morticia in the Addams Family was aiding the case for getting big-name bankable actors for movies based on TV shows. Houston, who was not only an incredibly talented actress, but also from an incredibly talented acting family, made it more socially acceptable for serious performers to accept roles in TV shows adapted for the big screen. The reason that studios love big names is because they provide industry influence, but they also function as insurance for the box office. Actors can make a lot of money from these parts as well, and they can often make a tidy profit during contract talks for sequels. Rounding out the main cast was Rosie O'Donnell, who wasn't the fans' first choice for Betty. I distinctly remember her being fat-shamed at the time, because the 90s was an awful time if you weren't a size 0, and honestly, she looked great in this movie, so what were we all worried about? She got the role because she could do Betty's distinct laugh, beating other actresses like Janine Turner, Daphne Zuniga and Tracy Ullman for the role. Sharon Stone was initially asked to play Miss Stone, aka Sharon Stone, and the actress was thrilled to be asked and to have a character named after her, but she was also unavailable. Halle Berry won the part, and for a moment the character's name was changed to Rosetta Stone, but Sharon Stone got the biggest laugh from the hundreds of writers, so she remained named Sharon Stone. Getting Elizabeth Taylor was a huge coup for the production. As one of the biggest screen stars in the 1950s, the highest paid movie star in the 1960s, and a personal life that garnered huge media attention. With Taylor out of the spotlight on hiatus for several years, focusing on her HIV/AIDS activism, The Flintstones would be her final theatrical performance. Producer Bruce Cohen went all out to entice Taylor to the role of Pearl Slaghoople, Wilma's extravagant mother. She would sign on the dotted line after the studio promised to donate the proceedings from the premiere of the movie to her HIV/AIDS foundation. The moment Taylor agreed, they took her favourite colour, lavender, gave her lavender stairs to her trailer, and filled that trailer with lavender flowers. It was tradition to give Taylor, as Hollywood royalty, lavish gifts for her first day of shooting. She loved Cartier, apparently, but they didn't have an Elizabeth Taylor-sized gift allotment in the budget. So Cohen went to Steven Spielberg, who wrote a personal cheque just for a Cartier watch with a sapphire jewel, as well as a sterling silver bowl for Taylor's beloved Pekingese dog Sugar, costing $15,000. One of the prop guys also made Taylor a prehistoric watch for her character, which cost about $12 and was apparently Elizabeth Taylor's favourite gift. Taylor used her role in the Flintstones and every on-screen appearance that followed as an opportunity to support people living with HIV and AIDS by donating her salary of $300,000 to the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, which still to this day continues to support people living with HIV and AIDS. Once the script and cast was in place and filming scheduled, Steven Spielberg would leave for Poland to shoot Schindler's List, but he was still incredibly involved with the creative decisions. He would have set design drawings and illustrations run past him and would regularly call the producers from Poland. The Bedrock set, which is probably one of the best examples of great production design in a movie ever, cost $4.5 million to create and build, which is 10% of the final budget of this movie. And real attention to detail went into the houses, cars, and creating an almost exact replica of Bedrock from the animated series. Filming in the then dormant Calmac Quarry, with the Flintstones' suburban street located adjacent to Vasquez Rocks in California. As you can imagine, filming during the middle of summer between May and August 1993 meant temperatures were often in the 40 degrees Celsius or over 100 Fahrenheit region, with many cast members wearing fur-like pelts. The costume design here, by the way, is incredible. Seriously, production design, set design, costumes, puppets and casting is all top-notch in this movie. William Sandell was brought on as production designer to bring the Flintstones universe from 2D to 3D. Sandell was the ideal candidate for the job because of his experience creating lifelike, fully functional sets for films like RoboCop and Total Recall. So the production design was by William Sandell and also Eloy Lobato, and the costume design was by Rosanna Norton. The production designers also included things like bubbling sulphur pits or mini volcanoes in the background of shots. Set decorator Rosemary Brandenburg reinvented the modern world into prehistoric, using fake fur for curtains, and concocted most of the set from foam, painting it to look like granite, slate, wood or quartz. The Venetian blinds in the slate offices, every blade was individually carved in the whole building. No glass was allowed on set at all due to the actors performing barefoot. With it being filmed in a Los Angeles County park, tourists would often crowd to watch filming happen. Universal Studios would have to beef up their security from 5 to 7 to keep spectators off the set, with people taking photos. Even after filming ended, the set was kept intact for people to be able to visit, but it was demolished shortly afterwards. With his photorealistic dinosaurs in Jurassic Park and his pre-existing relationship with Steven Spielberg, Stan Winston was the first choice to create the creatures and dinosaurs for the Flintstones. But after seeing draft designs of what Winston wanted to make, director Brian Levant wanted more cartoonish creations. It was watching the TV show Dinosaurs which inspired Levant to go with Jim Henson's Creature Shop instead. And the dinosaurs and creatures in this movie are one of the many highlights. ILM would also be involved for a CG version of Dino to complement the on-set puppet of Dino. Dino, built by John Stevenson of Jim Henson's Creature Shop, began as a $200,000 rubber suit inhabited by the actor Dave Foreman. Despite the remote-controlled neck, arm and tail, it became obvious after about 2 weeks of shooting that it wasn't cutting it, because no man is fast enough to mimic canine movements. The rest of Dino's full-body sequences were given to ILM. Puppet Dino looks better than CG Dino, but CG Dino looks remarkably good for an early 90s CG character. And to be honest, it's because they use him pretty sparingly. Foreman's work survives in the scene in which Dino greets Fred at the door and licks him, with a foot-long tongue coated with KY jelly. The Flintstones is also the first instance in a feature film of digital fur or hair rendering on the Flintstones family saber-toothed cat, which is probably another reason why we barely see this cat, because it took a huge amount of rendering time to render the realistic fur, so he's only seen in the opening and end title sequences. The scenes in the bowling alley were included at the last minute because the filmmakers realised that Fred regularly bowls in the animated series, and it was a great opportunity to show the Tippy Toes bowling strike as well as build on Fred and Barney's relationship. And so the story goes that filming ended, post-production started, post-production ended, and the movie was gonna be released. However, we need to talk about the story credit. In January 1994, Universal was seeking to name 9 people when it came time to turn in the final writing credits. Michael Wilson was supposed to receive a story credit, while Brian Levant, Al Adekman, Cindy Begel, Lloyd Garver, David Silverman, Steven Sustasik, Nancy Steen and Neil Thompson were supposed to receive a screenplay credit. However, this did not sit well with the Writers Guild of America. There was a well-known guild rule that a waiver must be obtained in advance if a writing team exceeds 2. The guild originally awarded sole screen credit to the writing team of Tom S. Parker and Jim Genowine, with story credit going to Michael J. Wilson. The group's members were determined to set a maximum credit limit of 3 writers, or writing teams for each film, and so this started a process of arbitration to agree who should receive the final credit for the Flintstones. The initial 8 members of the Flintstone 8 withdrew from the arbitration process, and so the WGA instead agreed to give credit to Stephen E. D'Souza, who'd written the first draft, and Jim Genowine and Tom S. Parker, whose contributions were deemed the biggest of all of the other writers. After the Flintstones writing debacle, the WGA would refine its arbitration rules, limiting writing credits to writers who've contributed a set amount to the final screenplay for a movie. And that, folks, is how you get from a team of 30 plus writers to 3 credited writers. Let's move on, though, to the obligatory Keanu reference of this episode. If you don't know what it is, it's where I try and link the movie that I'm featuring with Keanu Reeves for no reason other than he is the best of men. And it's a bit of a tough one, this. However, Keanu did star with Barney Rubble, Rick Moranis, in Parenthood, as well as Miss Stone, Halle Berry, in John Wick Chapter 3 Parabellum. And that was honestly the easiest way for me to do this. I suppose I could have just said Keanu Reeves was quite fine in 1994 and that probably would have sufficed. However, I just thought it was really nice that he starred with Rick Moranis and Halle Berry in other things. Let's move on to the music. So there is a song in this movie called The Bedrock Twitch. And this is the song that Barney and Fred sing as the film opens. And it's later performed by the BC-52s at Cavern on the Green. And this song premiered in the cartoon's 3rd season opener. The BC-52s filled out the song, which band member Fred Schneider said only had a couple of lyrics. The soundtrack also includes the BC-52s rendition of the classic Meet the Flintstones, which I remember being a pretty big hit here in the UK. It reached number 3, apparently. And the BC-52s are obviously the B-52s, probably most well known for the song Love Shack than pretty much anything else. We need to talk about the marketing, though, because the marketing machine for the Flintstones started early, a year before the movie's release. In the summer of 1993, trailers started to come out. But the tie-in merchandise was unlike anything seen before, except maybe for Tim Burton's Batman. The main promotional partner being McDonald's, who rebranded to RockDonald's for the partnership, which was their first ever global entertainment promotion. And this included Happy Meal toys, collectible glasses, and the return of the McRib sandwich and the Grand Poobah meal combo. The TV commercial was filmed on the same set at the same time the movie was filming, with Rosie O'Donnell starring as Betty, visiting RockDonald's for her server to chisel her order. The McDonald's merchandising and marketing campaign reportedly cost $45 million, the same amount of money that this movie cost to make. Unlike Jurassic Park the previous year, which had been seen as too scary for Happy Meal toys, McDonald's could quite literally go nuts with the Flintstones, and they did. There was also plushy talking toys of Fred, Wilma, Barney and Betty. They cost $34, as well as plastic toys made by Mattel, who only had a few months to design and produce them for that year's toy fair. There were also Flintstone bed sheets, plates, bath products, books, lunchboxes, rubble bubble gum, and a giant jawbreaker in the shape of Fred's bowling ball, as well as Flintstone vitamins capitalising on the movie by creating a Yabba Dabba Doo movie kit, in addition to their line of chewable vitamins that had been on the market since the late 1960s. The Flintstones was released on the 27th of May 1994 and immediately hit #1 at the domestic US box office, where it stayed for 2 weeks before being dethroned by Speed. There's another obligatory Keanu reference, 2 for the price of 1. It stayed in the top 10 for 8 weeks. It broke box office records during the Memorial Day weekend at the time for grossing $37.2 million during its opening weekend. It would be a huge box office success, grossing $130.5 million domestically and $211.1 million internationally, for a total worldwide gross of $341.6 million on a $45 million budget. While it did really well financially, it really didn't do very well critically. One of my favourite critics' reviews is from Michael Wilmington of the Chicago Tribune, who wrote that the film resembled, quote, a mountain of production, a rock of a cast, and a pebble of thought, unquote. It was derided by many as being too sophisticated for children and uninteresting for grown-ups. Since then, the film has earned a reputation as something that audiences can either tolerate or find easy to criticise. It was listed in several critics' year-end lists for 1994, unfortunately on the worst of list. Rosie O'Donnell and Elizabeth Taylor would receive nominations for the Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Supporting Actress. O'Donnell would go on to win, as well as Razzie nominations for Worst Screenplay and Worst Remake or Sequel. At the 1994 Stinkers Bad Movie Awards, the film was nominated for Worst Resurrection of a TV Show and Worst Actress for O'Donnell. The film also received 4 Saturn Award nominations, including Best Fantasy Film, Best Costume Design and Best Supporting Actress for O'Donnell and Berry's performances. For his part, John Goodman has always maintained he had a great time filming the movie, but felt strong-armed by Spielberg into doing it. He considered it a one-off favour to Spielberg and vowed not to return to the role of Fred Flintstone. And in fact, no one did. None of the original cast from the first film reprised their roles in the 2000 prequel, The Flintstones in Viva Rock Vegas. The film stars Mark Addy as Fred Flintstone, Stephen Baldwin as Barney Rubble, Kristen Johnston as Wilma Slaghoople, and Jane Krakowski as Betty O'Shale, replacing John Goodman, Rick Moranis, Elizabeth Perkins and Rosie O'Donnell respectively. The Flintstones in Viva Rock Vegas was a box office failure, grossing $59.5 million against its $83 million budget. It received mixed to negative reviews, but some critics considered it an improvement over the first film. And it's no big surprise that another live-action version of the Flintstones is not in development. In 2014, it was announced that Warner Brothers was developing an animated film with Chris Henchy, Will Ferrell and Adam McKay writing a script. In 2018, it was confirmed that the project was still in development and produced by Warner Animation Group. On the 9th of June 2023, as part of the restructuring of the Warner Animation Group, now called Warner Brothers Pictures Animation, it was announced that a new Flintstones movie titled Meet the Flintstones was in early development and is meant to be an origin story to the series. The movie will be written by Aaron Horvath and Michael Jelenic, who both previously directed the Super Mario Bros. Movie. So, while we're probably never going to get another live-action version of the Flintstones, this movie is actually the best live-action version of the Flintstones that we will probably ever get. So, that's something to be really positive about. And despite the fact that this is a family movie talking about real family problems like mundane jobs, embezzlement, mother-in-laws, adoption, technology replacing human workers, office politics, child endangerment, lynch mobs, and extramarital affairs, it also has a woolly mammoth showering water over John Goodman, and they just don't make them like that anymore. And nor did they before the Flintstones either. This is a genuine, heartfelt attempt to bring a cartoon to life, and it succeeds at that. I adore this movie. I saw it in the cinema as a kid, and I loved it then, and I still love it today. The exact duplication of the animated series opening and closing titles is sublime, and real, genuine care and attention has been made in the making of this movie to its source material. There's really no other movie like The Flintstones, a movie that pays homage to its roots and refuses to play it straight. It embraces everything wacky and zany, and it's about as close as a live-action cartoon as you could ever get. Nowadays, it's commonplace to take an animated original and remake it into live action, and to make it as faithful as possible. Think Disney's Aladdin or Beauty and the Beast. All the finer details were there, and yet they were pretty straight-laced and boring. The Flintstones may include a bit of corporate embezzlement, but this movie is never boring. The production design, set design, puppets, and casting is all spot on. For me, these are the definitive versions of these characters. I watched a bit of the Flintstones growing up, a bit of the Jetsons, but this movie was such a joy for me as a kid, and it's such a joy for me now. I acknowledge it has huge issues with the story and script, and a huge lack of use of characters like Wilma and Betty, which also harkens back to the cartoon. But this movie is very Fred-focused, and I would have liked a bit more character work. But when you've got 30-plus writers, I guess you kind of take what you're given. The creatures created by Jim Henson's Creature Shop are, as always, beautiful, intricate, and eye-catching. Dino is a terrific creation, as is the Dicta Bird, and even CG Dino doesn't look awful, but as I said, they use him sparingly. The costumes are also possibly the most cartoon accurate to exist in film. Seriously, this movie is gorgeous, and clearly directed by a huge fan of the show. For every mistake this movie makes in its story and script, it's matched by a plethora of innovative approaches in bringing these characters and their world to life. And that deserves to be celebrated, not just on this podcast, but just generally, because I think we forget what a huge task it would have been to put this world together, and it still looks incredible to this day. You could pull apart the plot with a toothpick. The idea that Barney and Fred switch tests, so Fred is the highest scorer, but why on earth would Cliff want the highest scoring employee to be the fall guy for an embezzlement scheme? Surely you'd want the dumbest guy. And the argument is often made that this is a kids' movie, and why would kids be interested in embezzlement? They wouldn't. I was a kid. I didn't understand why Fred got a swanky office job and lots of money, just that he did. This was a project made in the typical 30-year cycle of nostalgia. The Flintstones came out in the 60s, this came out in the 90s. We're now 30 years later, and the kids who grew up watching the Flintstones animated show are now grandparents. It just taps into that nostalgia of a show they loved watching. We forget just how massive and influential the Flintstones was, but it wasn't the first, and it won't be the last animated show that gets transported to live action. But nothing that comes out in future will be as lovingly crafted, living and breathing, and as faithful as this. This movie rocks. Yabba dabba do quote me on that. Thank you for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on the Flintstones. And as always, thank you for your continued support of this podcast. Get involved if you wish. It helps this podcast grow and be seen by more people. You could leave a rating or review wherever you found this podcast, or on Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or Podchaser, or Spotify, or wherever, really. It all helps. You could tell your friends and family about this podcast or about this episode if they happen to be a huge fan of the Flintstones, or maybe if they're not a huge fan of the Flintstones, and maybe they should become a huge fan of the Flintstones. I am unwaveringly positive on this podcast for a reason, because movies are really hard to make, and movies like the Flintstones are even harder to make than most. This movie deserves celebrating. Let's do that. Tell your family and friends. You can also find me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd at Verbal Diorama on all of those platforms. And if you liked this episode on the Flintstones, you might also like the following movies/episodes. So I've actually covered a couple of Hanna-Barbera adaptations before. I did episode 62 on Scooby-Doo. I did episode 87 on Josie and the Pussycats, which is a highly, highly underrated movie, by the way. I mentioned it earlier on in this episode, but episode 119 on the Addams Family, and 176 on Addams Family Values. They are all exceptional movies, and actually, they are all very fun episodes of this podcast as well. The Addams Family episode specifically is one of the biggest episodes this podcast has ever done. So if you're interested in live-action adaptations of animated series or film adaptations of original series, then please check out those movies and those episodes too. Next episode. It's going to be May. And I love a punny theme month. So May on Verbal Diorama is remake. Get it? It's a month of double episodes on both the original movie and its modern remake. Starting with, releasing the Kraken. The next episode is going to be on the original Clash of the Titans from 1981, featuring Ray Harryhausen's terrific stop-motion creatures, and its modern remake 2010's Clash of the Titans, which has no Harryhausen, but instead was converted into 3D, and Liam Neeson would go on to become his own meme. So please join me next episode for the history and legacy of Clash of the Titans 1981 and Clash of the Titans 2010. And all month you can expect double episodes featuring originals and remakes. It's going to be a busy month, but it's going to be so much fun. So join me next episode for that. This podcast is free, and it always will be free and available for everyone. However, if you do have a bit of spare change and you do want to support the show financially, there are a couple of ways to do that. You could go to verbaldiorama.com/tips and give a one-off tip, or you can go to verbaldiorama.com/Patreon and you can join the amazing patrons of Verbal Diorama. They are Simon E, Sade, Claudia, Simon B, Laurel, Derek, Kat, Andy, Mike, Luke, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Lisa, Sam, Jack, Dave, Stuart, Nicholas, Zoe, Kev, Pete, Heather, Danny, Ali, Stu, Brett, Philip, Michelle, Zenos, Sean, Reno and Russell. If you want to get in touch with me, you can email me verbaldiorama@gmail.com, or you can go to my website verbaldiorama.com. You can find all old episodes of the show. You can find a little bit about me, and you can also find a contact me page as well. And you can also find my work at filmstories.co.uk. You can find issues of the magazine and also online articles too. And finally,
Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. They're a modest found a bedrock. They're a piece right out of history. Someday, maybe Fred will win the fight. Then that cat will stay up for the night. When you're with the Flintstones, gather, gather, gather inside. Gather inside. We'll have a gay old time.
Elmer!
We'll have a gay old time.
bye.
Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequel, sequel,